Welcome to another video of Dark History. Dark History is a series in which I cover some of the darkest things to have ever happened in the history of our world. We now live in a pretty civilized world, but it wasn't always like that. In today's video, I discuss and examine some of the darkest historical figures that have plagued the world with hatred and absolute cruelty. Tomás de Torquemada. To many, the name sounds torturous and cruel. Well, Tomás de Torquemada was exactly that. He was one of the most intolerant men in a time of intolerant men. Torquemada was a Jew, born into a family of converted Christians, but he turned most of his anger and hatred against his very own people. With energy and connections, it was unavoidable that Torquemada should rise to power. After studying and learning theology at the Dominican convent of San Pablo in Valladolid, he became prior of Santa Cruz Convent in Segovia. He also became confessor to the royal court. There, he discovered that many Jewish converts were secretly practicing Judaic rites while outwardly pretending to be Christians. He then whispered this newfound information in the ears of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. He assisted the royal couple draft a request for an inquisition into this matter. The request was granted. In 1483, Tomás de Torquemada was made Grand Inquisitor. Torquemada developed an oppressive network of spies and secret police. He had his court summon thousands upon thousands of individuals. The majority of them were completely lost as to what they supposedly had done wrong. 1/3 of these said individuals were tortured. The three most common torture methods used during these acts of hatred were to be hung by the arms until they were pulled from their sockets, to be forced to swallow gallons of water, and to be racked. The Inquisition kept records of the interrogations, and these show people begging to be told what to admit so that they could escape their unfortunate agony. "I have said that I did all that the witnesses say. Señors, release me, for I do not remember it. For God's sake, have mercy on me," one woman pleaded. A man who also underwent the torture insisted that he was a good Catholic. If they desired him to speak he was a heretic, he would do so because of the agonizing pain from the torture. Worse than the torture and cruelty was the underlying fear of immolation, being offered as a sacrifice. Torquemada burned and scorched over 2,000 guilty victims. Naturally, with such a high record, he was loathed. He found it necessary to go about with multiple bodyguards by his side everywhere he went. Even the Pope himself couldn't stop or put an end to his hateful work. When Sixtus IV in a bull absolved all the conversos of any wrongdoing they might have done, Ferdinand refused to be bound by the bull. Torquemada continued the persecution and Sixtus backed down. Torquemada then extended his reach. He had every single unconverted Jew expelled from Spain. Completely absurdly and tragically, his hateful, brutal business was done in the name of Jesus Christ, who never raised a finger to hurt anyone, but willingly gave his own life for others. However, death will unfortunately and eventually reach us all. On the date of September 16, 1498, at the old age of 78, Torquemada died. If Spain hoped his death would lead to the termination of brutality, they hoped in vain. His legacy of torture and hatred lived on long after he passed, with brand new victims suffering the same and unfortunate fate. Number 2. H.H. Holmes. H.H. Holmes was infamously known as America's first serial killer. In the year of 1861, Herman Webster Mudgett was born in New Hampshire. It is believed that at a very early age he was interested in skeletons and not too long after became obsessed with death itself. It may have been this fascination with death that's led him to pursue medicine. After graduating high school at 16 years old, Mudgett changed his name to Henry Howard Holmes, and later would become known as the infamous H.H. Holmes. Holmes began studying medicine at a small school in Vermont before he was eventually accepted into the University of Michigan Medical School. While enrolled in medical school, Holmes stole cadavers from the laboratory, burned and disfigured them, then planted the bodies, making it look as if they had been killed in an accident. The scandal behind it was that Holmes would take out insurance policies on these people before planning the bodies and would claim the money once the bodies were found. In 1884, Holmes passed all of his medical exams, and in 1885 he moved to Chicago, where he got a job working at a pharmacy under the alias Dr. Henry Holmes. When the owner of the drugstore passed away, he left his wife to take over the duties of running the store. However, Holmes had other plans. He managed to convince the widow to let him buy the store. The widow soon went missing and was never seen or heard of again. Holmes claimed that she relocated to California, but this could never be verified. After Holmes had become the owner of the new drugstore, he bought an empty lot across the street. He designed and built a 3-story hotel which the neighborhood referred to as the Castle. During its 1889 construction, Holmes hired and fired several construction crews so that no one would have a clear idea of just what he was planning to do. He was designing a murder castle. After the construction was completed in 1891, Holmes then began to place ads in newspapers all over town offering jobs for young women, and he advertised the castle as a place of lodging. He also placed ads presenting himself as a wealthy man looking for a wife. All of Holmes' employees, hotel guests, fiancés, and wives were required to have life insurance policies. Holmes paid for the premiums as long as they listed him as the beneficiary. Mostly all of his fiancés and wives would suddenly vanish, as did many of his employees and guests. Many people in the neighborhood would eventually report that they saw multiple women enter the castle, but that they would never see them exit. In the year of 1893, Chicago was given the great opportunity of hosting the World's Fair, a cultural and social event to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus' discovery of America. The event in question was scheduled for May to October and allured millions of people from all over the world. When Holmes discovered that the World's Fair was going to be coming to Chicago, he viewed it as an opportunity. He knew that many visitors would be searching for a place to stay near the fair and believed many of them would be women whom he could easily manipulate and seduce into staying in his hotel. After being persuaded to stay at his hotel, many of these out-of-town visitors would never be seen or heard of again. The first level of the castle had several stores. The 2 upper levels contained Holmes' office and workspace, and over 100 rooms that were used as living quarters. Some of these rooms were soundproof and contained gas lines, so that Holmes could suffocate his guests whenever he wanted to do so. Throughout the building there were trapdoors and peepholes, stairways that led to nowhere, and chutes that led into the basement. The basement was created and designed to be Holmes' very own lab. It featured a dissecting table, a stretching rack, and a crematory. At times, he would send the bodies down the chute, dissect them, strip them of all of their flesh, and sell them as human skeleton models to medical schools. In other cases, he would choose to cremate or place the bodies into pits of acids for his twisted enjoyment. Through all of this, Holmes would travel throughout the United States committing insurance scams with his accomplice, Benjamin Pitezel. Once the World's Fair had finally come to an end, Chicago's economy was in a slump, which led to Holmes abandoning the castle to focus on insurance scams, committing random murders along the way. During the time of this, Holmes would steal horses from Texas, have them shipped to St. Louis, and sold them, making a fortune in the process. He was eventually arrested for this swindle and sent to jail. While in jail, he plotted a new insurance scam with his cellmate, Marion Hedgepeth. Holmes planned to take out an insurance policy for $10,000, fake his own death, and then provide Hedgepeth with $500 in exchange for a lawyer who could help him if any problems would ever arise. Once Holmes was released from jail on bail, he attempted to put his new plan in motion. However, the insurance company was suspicious and refused to pay him. Holmes then decided to attempt a similar plan in Philadelphia. This time he would have Pitezel fake his own death. However, during this scam, Holmes betrayed Pitezel and killed him to collect the money for himself. In 1894, Hedgepeth, who was angry that he didn't receive any of the money in the initial scam, told the police about the scam Holmes had planned. The police tracked down Holmes, finally catching up to him in Boston, where they arrested him and held him on an outstanding warrant for the Texas horse swindle. At the time of his arrest, Holmes appeared as if he was preparing to flee the country, and the police became suspicious of him. The Chicago police investigated Holmes' castle where they discovered his strange and efficient methods for committing torturous murders. Many of the bodies they found were so badly dismembered and decomposed that it was hard for them to determine exactly how many bodies there really were. The police investigation spread through Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto. While they were conducting their investigation in Toronto, the police had discovered the bodies of the Pitzel children, who had gone missing sometime during the spree of Holmes' insurance fraud. Linking Holmes to their murders, the police arrested him and he was convicted of their murders. He also confessed to 28 other murders. However, through investigations and missing persons reports, it is believed that Holmes is responsible for up to 200 murders, and possibly even more. In May 1896, one of America's very first serial killers, H. Holmes, was hanged. The castle was then remodeled as an attraction and named the Holmes Horror Castle. However, shortly after, the castle had burned to the ground before it ever opened. Number 3. Madame Delphine LaLaurie. Madame LaLaurie was a New Orleans Creole socialite and serial killer, infamously known for torturing and murdering slaves in her own home. LaLaurie was born on March 19, 1787. Her family moved from Ireland to New Orleans. She married her first husband in 1800 to a Spanish officer. In 1804, they moved to Spain. LaLaurie gave birth to her first daughter, Marie, en route. Her husband unfortunately passed away before they reached Madrid. Back in New Orleans, LaLaurie married a banker and had 4 more children with him. Her second husband died 8 years later after they had gotten married. Finally, she married her third husband, Leonard LaLaurie, a doctor, in 1825, and together they owned a mansion where she and her husband and 2 daughters lived. The LaLauries had several black slaves in their slave quarters, which was attached to the Royal Street Mansion. There are many accounts of Delphine LaLaurie's treatment of her slaves between 1831 and 1834, but are mixed. Harriet Martineau, writing in 1838 and recounting tales told to her by New Orleans residents during her 1836 visit, claimed that LaLaurie's slaves were seen to be extremely exhausted and miserable. However, in public appearances, LaLaurie was known to be generally kind to black people and considerate of her slaves' health. Court documents of the time showed that LaLaurie had released 2 of her slaves. Martineau had written that public rumors about LaLaurie's vicious mistreatment of her slaves were widely spread to the point that a local lawyer was sent to Royal Street to remind LaLaurie of the laws about the upkeeping of slaves. However, during the lawyer's visit to the mansion, he found no evidence of wrongdoing or mistreatment of slaves by LaLaurie. Martineau also recounted other stories of LaLaurie's cruelty that were current among the New Orleans residents around 1836. She said that following the visit from the lawyer, one of LaLaurie's neighbors witnessed one of LaLaurie's slaves named Leah, a 12-year-old girl, fall to her death from the roof of the Royal Street Mansion, while attempting to avoid mistreatment from a hateful, whip-wielding Delphine LaLaurie. Leah was said to have been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, which then caused Delphine to grab a hold of a whip and chase her. After these events, Leah's body was buried on the mansion grounds. According to Martineau, this incident led to a full investigation of the LaLauries, in which they were found guilty of unlawful brutality and was then forced to surrender 9 slaves. Unfortunately, however, these very 9 slaves were then purchased back by the LaLauries through a negotiative relative, and then returned to the Royal Street residence. Similarly, Martineau recounted tales that LaLaurie kept her cook chained to the kitchen stove, and would also beat her daughters whenever they tried to offer food to the slaves. On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out in the LaLaurie residence on Royal Street, which started in the kitchen. When the authorities and fire marshals arrived, they found the cook, a 70-year-old woman, was chained to the stove by her ankle. She later said that she had set the fire as an attempt to commit suicide because she was terrified of being punished. She said that the slaves, who were taken to the highest level room, never returned. As reported in the New Orleans Bee of April 11, 1834, bystanding citizens responding to the fire attempted to enter the slave quarters to ensure that everyone had been safely evacuated. The LaLauries refused to grant access to the keys, so the bystanders broke down the doors to the slave quarters, and what they found was absolutely horrific. They found 7 or more slaves that had been horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck with their limbs stretched and torn from one extremity to the other, who claimed to have been imprisoned there for months. One of the individuals who had entered the mansion was Judge Jean-Francois Canni, who subsequently deposed having found in the LaLaurie mansion, among others, a black girl wearing an iron collar, and an old black woman who had received a very deep wound on her head who was too weak to walk. Canni said that when he asked Madame LaLaurie's husband questions about the tortured and horribly mistreated slaves, he responded in a rude manner that some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business. There's another version of this story circulating in 1836 which, recounted by Martineau, added that slaves were emaciated, showed signs of being flayed with a whip, were bound in restrictive postures, and wore spiked iron collars which kept their heads in static positions. When the discovery and the truth of Delphine LaLaurie's abused slaves were revealed to the public, a mob of local citizens attacked the LaLaurie residence and demolished and destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands on. One sheriff and his officers were called upon to break up the crowd, but by the time the mob left, the Royal Street property had suffered extreme damage, with scarcely anything remaining but the walls. The slaves were transported to a local jail where they were available for public viewing. The New Orleans Bee reported that by April 12th, up to 4,000 people had attended to view the slaves to convince themselves of their sufferings. The Pittsfield Sun stated that the New Orleans Advertiser, and wrote several weeks after the evacuation of LaLaurie's slave quarters, claimed that 2 of the slaves that were found in LaLaurie's mansion had died since their rescue. It added, "We understand that in digging the yard, bodies have been disinterred, and the condemned dwell in the grounds of the mansion. Having been uncovered, others, particular that of a child, were found." All of these claims were repeated by Martineau in her 1838 book Retrospect of Western Travel, where she placed the number of unearthed bodies at 2, including the child. After the fire at the LaLaurie mansion, there wasn't any well-documented information regarding Delphine LaLaurie's life. LaLaurie was said to have fled New Orleans during the mob violence that followed the fire, taking a coach to the waterfront and traveling from Schooner to Mobile, Alabama, and then to Paris. The circumstances surrounding the death of Delphine LaLaurie are also unclear. There are many different tales of her possible death, but none are for certain. According to the French archives of Paris, Marie Delphine McCarthy died on December 7, 1849 at the age of 62. For a woman who spent a great deal of her life torturing and murdering slaves, I think it's safe to say Madame Delphine LaLaurie wasn't missed. Number 4. Elizabeth Bathory, also known as the Blood Countess. Countess Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman and alleged serial killer from the noble family of Bathory, who owned land in the Kingdom of Hungary. She had been labeled by Guinness World Records as the most prolific female murderer, though the exact amount of her victims is debated. Born into a privileged family of integrity, Elizabeth was showered and endowed with wealth, education, and a marvelous social position. She is said to have suffered from fits and outbursts of rage, and possibly even epilepsy. From a very early age, she witnessed her father's officers torture the peasants that lived near her family's estate. Throughout history, analysis of the Countess includes young Elizabeth witnessing a captured thief being sewn into the stomach of a dying horse and left to perish. This story underscores 2 crucial aspects that possibly may have influenced Bathory: exposure to extreme violence and her family's accepting attitude toward it. There's many accounts that depict her fondness for causing others pain and claim that she had accomplices who worked with her in these violent acts of cruelty. One of those individuals may have possibly been her husband, Ferenc Nadasti. As for the others, it is believed it was members of her court. Nadasti married Bathory when she was only 15 years of age. He was a soldier who spent much of his time away from home. There's speculation that Nadasti may have taught his wife new methods of torture, while other researchers believe he was blissfully ignorant of her violent atrocities. What's certainly agreed upon is that Bathory committed most of her crimes in his absence. Bathory had a great desire for torturing young girls specifically. The acts she committed ranged from inserting needles through the lips and fingernails of her servants to leaving her victims naked in the snow, dousing them with water, and leaving them to freeze to death. One servant girl was beaten to death by Bathory and one of her accomplices for stealing a pear. The clubbing was so gruesome and gory that Bathory had to change her clothes. The girl was repeatedly beaten for hours until she was finally stabbed to death with a pair of scissors. Bathory's cruel acts have a way of generating a combination of truth and legend. Possibly the most infamous legend surrounding Bathory is that she enjoyed bathing in the blood of her victims. Inevitably, this led to many rumors that she was a vampire. This legend was first published in 1720 by a Hungarian priest who conducted interviews with nearby peasants and read the testimonies from the trials of Bathory's accomplices. She reportedly bathed in her victims' blood because she believed it would keep her skin young and youthful. In addition to bathing in blood, she specifically enjoyed bathing in the blood of virgins. The official testimony of Elizabeth Bathory's murders, which still exists to this day, which is in Hungarian archives, both draws questions and is convicting in nature. In late 1610, a cousin of Elizabeth set up a raid on Bathory's castle. Inside of it, there were already multiple deceased victims, and some that were imprisoned, supposedly awaiting their deaths. All of Bathory's accomplices were arrested and put on trial, but she wasn't. These testimonies draw many questions because they were most likely culled from acts of torture inflicted on Bathory's own accomplices. But the fact that there were even trials to begin with concerning Bathory's murders gives some credibility to the story surrounding her. From all of the testimonies, the number 650 was settled upon as the number of victims that she killed. One witness apparently testified that Bathory kept a registry of her crimes, which numbered to 650. However, none of this testimony led to a trial for Bathory. Instead, she was walled into a room, closed in with just enough space for air to breathe and food to pass through. She spent the final 4 years of her life there until she was found dead on the floor in 1614. Her bloody life, whether exaggerated or factual, had finally come to a conclusion, and Elizabeth Bathory entered the realm of legend. Number 5. Vlad the Impaler. There's a very select few of names that have instilled more terror into humanity other than the fictional vampire Dracula, created by author Bram Stoker in his 1897 novel of the same name. It has inspired countless horror films, TV shows, and other blood-curdling stories about the blood-sucking creatures of the night. However, Dracula is purely a fictional character. Stoker named his infamous character after a real person who happened to enjoy the taste of blood. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, or as he is better known today, Vlad the Impaler. The gruesome nickname is a testimonial to the Wallachian prince's favorite method of disposing of his enemies. But besides having the same names, the two Draculas don't really have too much in common. By most accounts, Vlad III was born in 1431 in what is now Transylvania, the central region of modern-day Romania. However, the connection between Vlad the Impaler and Transylvania is very thin. Stoker's Dracula has a connection to Transylvania, but the real historic Dracula, Vlad III, never owned anything in Transylvania. Bran Castle, a modern-day attraction for tourists in Transylvania that is often referred to as Dracula's Castle, was never the residence of the Wallachian prince. Vlad III's father, Vlad II, did own a home in Transylvania, but it isn't for certain that Vlad III was born there. It's also very likely that Vlad the Impaler was born in Targavaste, which was at the time the royal seat of the principals of Wallachia, where his father was a ruler. At around the early age of 12 years old, Vlad III and his brother were thrown in prison in Turkey. In 1431, Vlad II was inducted into a knightly order, the Order of the Dragon. This nomination earned Vlad II a new surname, Dracul. The name Dracul came from the Romanian word for dragon. His son, Vlad III, would later be known as the son of Dracul, or in an Old Romanian, Dracula. In modern Romanian, the word Drac refers to another deeply feared and evil creature, the devil. The Order of the Dragon was completely dedicated to one single task, the defeat of the Turkish or Ottoman Empire. Located between Christian Europe and the Muslim lands of the Ottoman Empire, Vlad II's home principality of Wallachia was often the scene of gruesome battles. as Ottoman forces pushed westward into Europe and Christian forces repulsed the invaders. When Vlad II was called into a diplomatic meeting in 1442 with Ottoman Sultan Murad II, he brought his young sons Vlad III and Radu along. But it turned out the meeting in question was actually a trap. All three of them were imprisoned and held hostage. The elder Vlad was released under the condition that he would leave his sons behind. To be ensured that Vlad II would behave himself in the ongoing war between Turkey and Hungary, the Sultan held Vlad and his brothers as hostages. Under the Ottomans, Vlad and his younger brother were taught in science, philosophy, and the arts. Vlad also became a very skilled horseman and warrior. They were apparently treated very well by the current standards of time. Regardless though, captivity still irked Vlad, whereas his brothers sort of accepted and went over on the Turkish side. But Vlad held bad blood, and it's believed it was one of his motivating factors for fighting the Turks, to get even with them for having held him imprisoned. While Vlad and Radu were in Ottoman hands, Vlad's father was fighting to keep his place as warlord of Wallachia, a fight he would later lose. In 1447, Vlad II was ousted as ruler of Wallachia by local noblemen and was murdered in the swamps near Baltani, halfway between Targovaste and Bucharest in present-day Romania. Vlad's older brother Mircea was also killed along with his father. Not long after these tormenting events in 1448, Vlad embarked on a campaign to take back his father's seat from the new ruler, Vladislav II. His first attempt at the throne relied on the military support of the Ottoman governors of the cities along the Danube River in northern Bulgaria. Vlad also took advantage of the fact that Vladislav was absent at the time, having went to the Balkans to fight the Ottomans for the governor of Hungary at the time, John Hunyadi. Vlad eventually won back his father's seat, but his time as ruler of Wallachia didn't last very long. After just 2 months, he was dethroned when Vladislav II returned and took back the throne of Wallachia with the assistance of Hunyadi. Very little is known about Vlad III's life between 1448 and 1456, but it is known that he switched sides in the Ottoman-Hungarian conflict, giving up his ties with the Ottoman governors of the Danube cities, and obtaining military support from King Ladislav V of Hungary, who happened to dislike Vlad's rival, Vladislav II of Wallachia. Vlad III's political and military tact truly came to the forefront amid the fall of Constantinople in 1453. After the fall, the Ottomans were in position to invade all of Europe. Vlad, who had already solidified his anti-Ottoman position, was proclaimed warlord of Wallachia in 1456. One of his first orders of business in his new role was to stop paying an annual tribute to the Ottoman Sultan, a measure that had formerly ensured peace between the Wallachia and the Ottomans. To reinforce his power as warlord, Vlad needed to subdue the constant conflicts that had historically taken place between the Wallachia's boyars. According to the legends that went around after his death, Vlad invited hundreds of these boyars to a banquet and, knowing they would challenge his authority, had all of his guests stabbed and their still-twitching bodies impaled on spikes. This is just one of many gory events that earned Vlad his infamous nickname, Vlad the Impaler. Vlad is credited with impaling dozens of Saxon merchants who were once allied with the boyars in 1456. Around the same time, a group of Ottoman envoys allegedly had an audience with Vlad but declined to remove their turbans, citing a religious custom. Commending them on their religious devotion, Vlad ensured that their turbans would forever remain on their heads by reportedly having the head coverings nailed to their skulls. Vlad's victories over the invading Ottomans were celebrated throughout Wallachia, Transylvania, and the rest of Europe. Even Pope Pius II was impressed. Not long after the impalement of the Ottoman prisoners of war, in August 1462, Vlad was forced into exile into Hungary, unable to defeat his much more powerful adversary, Mehmet II. Vlad was imprisoned for a number of years during his exile, though during that time he married and had 2 children. Vlad's younger brother Radu, who had sided with the Ottomans during the ongoing military campaigns, took over governance of Wallachia after his brother's imprisonment. But after Radu's death in 1475, local boyars as well as the rulers of several nearby principalities favored Vlad's return to power. In 1476, with the support of warlord Stephen III the Great, Vlad made one last effort to reclaim his seat as ruler of Wallachia. He successfully stole back the throne, but his time was short-lived. Later that year, while marching to yet another battle with the Ottomans, Vlad and a small vanguard of soldiers were ambushed, and Vlad was killed. There is much controversy over the location of Vlad III's tomb. One thing is for certain, however. Unlike Stoker's Count Dracula, Vlad III most certainly did die. Only the harrowing tales of his years as ruler of Wallachia remain to haunt the modern world. Well guys, there you have it. This was my second installment of Dark History. If you enjoyed this video and would like a part 2 for 5 more terrifying historical dark figures, be sure to like this video and comment below. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope you're ready for more dark history. Until the next one, remember to always stay hungry. So once again, I just want to shout out my $5 patrons like I do at the end of all of my videos. A huge thank you to Ulisa, Babe Lincoln, Kate E., Carrie B., Celeste S., Courtney T., Ellie S., Howard R., Jacqueline W., Jazzy G., Jennifer M., Jess, Jonathan C., Catherine M., Carrie F., Matthew B., Michael G., Sage V., Steph L., Terry H. Thank all of you so much for being a patron and supporting me on Patreon. And if any of you would like a shout out in one of my videos just like this, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Canni. I will also feature all of my $3 and up patrons in my outro, as a special shout out for them as well. So thank you all so much.